Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. I'm Suzanne Atwell. Our focus, low voter turnout, the decline of engagement by the electorate, and hope that an amendment to the charter of the City of Sarasota will reverse that trend. Here is what we are talking about. This is the ballot language for the upcoming November election. If passed, it will change City Commission elections from March and May in odd number years to August and November in even numbered years to coincide with federal, state, and county elections. Full disclosure, I am co-chair of the organization which is advocating to change the date. I tried for years to move toward a commission-initiated ballot referendum, both as mayor and as city commissioner, but sadly politics and special interests always prevailed. Low voter turnout has been a headline for at least the past 20 years. 2003, regular district, 14.72% turnout. 2005, second election, at large, 16.93% turnout. 2007, regular district, 13.93% turnout. 2009, second at-large election, 15.67% turnout. More recently, 2017 regular district at large, 19.14% turnout. While we had a record turnout in the most recent primary, voters are not showing up, either out of apathy, voting dates, lack of interest in the candidates, or a combination of all of the above. The facts cannot be disputed. To understand more about this, we turn to Sarasota Supervisor of Elections, Ron Turner. Welcome, Ron. We're here at the Supervisor of Elections office. I want to talk about City of Sarasota, a little bit of background information. Tell us when and how the city elections have been currently scheduled.
Well, currently city elections are scheduled in the spring in odd numbered years in the city of Sarasota. So there is a March 1st election and then a May 2nd election, if that's necessary, for a runoff election in the city elections. And that has been going on for a number of years. I'm not sure when that started, but as long as I can remember, that's been the case.
Talk about other cities in the county. How do they do it?
The Longboat Key also does a spring election. We do their election as well in the spring. They do a January preliminary election, potentially, but we haven't had one of those in a while. And then they do a March is kind of their general election. So part of that depends on the number of candidates that they have. But so they have spring election also. Venice does a November election. They have 3-year terms, so they have a November election every year.
How recently did they do that?
The 3-year terms? I'm not sure. It's been a while, again, as far as I can remember. So we potentially have a Venice race if they're candidates every November. It's on the ballot this November. And then the city of Northport also does the August-November cycle as well.
So when you take Sarasota and some of the other cities in the county and you compare voter turnout, what do you see? When you've got two different approaches in some of our county, what comes out of that?
Well, I would say that certainly voter turnout, depends on a lot of different factors. Some people were talking about timing now as an issue potentially for voter turnout, but also really candidates and issues tend to drive voter turnout also, or their hot races on the ballot, those sorts of things that you say, like when we had a House District 72 special election, that was a singular focus, but we had the second highest turnout in modern Florida history in a special election. So, there are a lot of different factors that kind of play into that. Obviously, general elections tend to get the highest turnout, presidential elections. Sure. We had about 77% in 2016, so that's a little bit higher than the state average of 75%. 4 years ago in this gubernatorial general election that's upcoming, we had a 57% turnout. I expect that the turnout could be possibly even higher this time because we're seeing, some higher turnouts recently in our elections. So,
Well, historically, the turnout for Sarasota elections in March and May have been quite low. Checking back to '03, I think, as low as 13%, and sort of on a regular basis, about 20%. Never got much above that. So, what are the negative implications of chronic low turnout, and is it necessarily linear? Is it always going down, the low turnout, or is that every so often that's an anomaly?
Yeah, I don't think it's a linear thing. I mean, we saw in this recent primary, right? So we had almost a 32% turnout in the recent primary. That was our highest turnout in Sarasota County since 1994. So that's 24 years, right? The next highest would have been in 2002 at like 29% for the primary. So it's certainly not a linear thing. Again, I think it depends on the candidates, the issues, what's going on at that time. We've seen a lot of interest in the primary election that we just had because you had a lot more races that were on the ballot. You had a governor's race, open seat because the governor was term limited, cabinet members term limited, U.S. Senate, kind of race. So you had in school highly, contested school board races. So you had a lot on the ballot for people to vote on. So I do think that has some, impacts also. So it's not a linear thing. It's not always easy to predict. We look at voter turnout patterns because it helps us plan our resources for elections. But that's not always the easiest thing to predict either. So.
Sure, because you never know what's coming down the pike as far as issues.
You don't. Button. Right. And things, information moves so quickly today through the media, like what we're sitting here doing, talking right now, social media, those sorts of things. So voters communicate in ways, receive information in ways that they didn't even 5 or 6 years ago, I think.
And also we have, what is the percentage of those who vote by mail? And how does that reflect all this dynamic that if half the people have voted by mail, and people are still campaigning and having forums, how has that changed that dynamic of getting the information for candidates out if half the people have voted?
Well, it definitely has changed. I mean, you no longer have just an election day. Election day stretches a lot longer for several weeks. So vote by mail ballots, the first ballots that go out before any election go to military and overseas voters 45 days before an election. And then domestic vote by mail ballots go out starting 35 days before an election. And then early voting, depending on what the election is. So for the primary, we had 8 days of early voting. For this general election in November, early voting will start October 22nd, which is a Monday, run through Saturday, November 3rd. That's 13 days, so almost 2 weeks of early voting, 10 hours per day. 8:30 to 6:30 every day at 6 locations throughout Sarasota County. So from Northport, Venice, North Sarasota Library, Fruitville Library, here at the Terrace Building, and also Westfield Sarasota Square Mall, which has been a very popular voting site in the county for us in recent years.
Have you brought any more voting sites up? Have any ever closed, had to be revamped for different elections? How does that work on the voting sites? You hear a lot about that.
That's kind of interesting. Yes, many of our sites are pretty stable. We keep using the same election day sites. Sometimes we will have locations that are no longer interested in having us there. Or, we need to make sure sites are accessible and that sort of thing. So any of those issues factor in to our sites. But, we have to have these sites set well before an election. So we start maybe a year before an election contacting our sites to make sure that they're going to be available. We have agreements with them. For the primary, for early voting, we added North Sarasota Library as a site, which had, I believe, more than 800 people that voted there. So it was a significant increase from past primaries, but that site hadn't been used for primaries in a few election cycles, but we did add it back in the primary.
So do you use a threshold, or not necessarily, that you said it increased 800 people, but if there were only 100 people voting, what would happen?
Well, I believe the last time it was open, that was with, I believe that there were maybe 180, so
Okay.
this time we had about 800. Is there a hard and fast formula? No. Part of it's going to be like that, looking at numbers and resources. Part of it's going to look at community interest. There was a lot of interest in having this as a site
Sure.
again, so certainly, I'm willing to take a look at and trying to find those sites that are located as close to kind of population centers where the voters are, and
Exactly.
take a broad enough approach, because my job as supervisor is to make sure that the election's fair and secure, but also accessible to the
Inclusive.
voters. Yeah.
And inclusive. And just finally to wrap up, I'm not asking your opinion on the so-called change the date referendum, but let me ask you this in terms of measuring voter turnout, engagement. Is higher turnout more representative of the majority of registered voters, or does it not matter?
Well, that's a good question, and I've heard this question discussed, and I get asked this question about voter turnout quite a bit. And thank you for saying you're not asking my opinion, because as I've shared with you before, supervisor, I'm not going to give my opinion on the issue, the question, because it's on the ballot, and I'm responsible for counting the votes. So I'm going to leave it in the good hands of the voters, because I have the full confidence that the voters in the city of Sarasota will make whatever decision is right for them.
And I bet you'll have the last word on my last question. And finally, if the referendum change the date passes, do you think, generally speaking, it will increase, decrease, or have no impact on voter turnout? What's your
Well,
last word?
What's my last word? We'll have to see. If it passes, right, we'll see what happens come 2020 during the next presidential cycle, because that's when we would have it on the ballot if it does pass. So I think it's just something you have to wait and see if the voters decide to adopt this framework, and then we'll see, we can measure it then.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate it.
Those who believe in changing the date include many of the top civic and professional organizations in the city: the Fraternal Union of Police, the NAACP, the ACLU, Gulf Coast Builders Exchange, and the Chamber of Commerce, just to name a few. We spoke with the CEO and president of the Chamber, Kevin Cooper. Kevin, welcome. You're the CEO of the Sarasota County Chamber of Commerce. You represent the business community. Why have you become, along with many other agencies and organizations, involved in Change the Date? Why?
It's a great question, and really what it boiled down for our board of directors and our organization was it was a quality of life issue. Civic participation is really at the foundational root of a healthy community. And what we saw in the city of Sarasota through voter participation was we had a really underlying foundational problem with our civic participation. And we had done years of get out the vote campaigns trying to move that needle, and we saw it wasn't happening. And through leadership of yours and other city commissioners, we saw it was not coming through City Hall. And so we took it upon ourselves to make it happen. We wanted to give the voters the opportunity to have their voice heard, to see if they wanted to make their voice heard.
So how do the other agencies that are on board are fairly different in scope? Why are they getting on board? Same reason? You have the ACLU, you have different agencies, Gulf Coast Business. What's that all about now?
I think it's just a unified perspective on what the right thing for the community to do is. And I would assume each organization has their own little slice of why it makes the most sense for them. But I think in a general perspective, we're able to come together around one single philosophical piece, which is that a better voter engagement through voter participation in the electorate is important for the community at large. It is a quality of life issue for all of us, and that's why we can all get on the same page.
Tell me about the resistance.
Yeah, I haven't seen much of an organized resistance per se, but there are people out there that aren't fans of it, and so it's interesting to watch the arguments come forward. A lot of them, I think, are kind of disparate. They're not really in the data that we are trying to present. They're kind of supposition, a little bit of half-truths, a little bit of, well, maybe this, maybe that. But really none of it looks at the fact that what we are doing is trying to push voter participation in the city, by the way, which will double or triple when you move the elections to the general cycle. And so for us, there is no trade-off that creates a better outcome than voter participation tripling in the city of Sarasota.
Talk about the dark money. Is that something that we need to deal with?
Nothing about the proposal at all attacks campaign finance regulations. So what can be donated in the spring can be donated in the fall. And when we look around in our sister cities here in Sarasota County, when you look to Northport, when you look to Venice, who hosts elections on general cycles, we don't hear a cry that says, hey, dark money is in here doing what it does. I think it's kind of this supposition. It's fear-mongering. It's the boogeyman. Just you wait. There's going to be this dark money. Look, money can do tomorrow what it can do today. If this initiative passes, there's no change at all in what PACs can do.
It's interesting, when I ran in '09, won big, and I got more votes than any city commissioner has in quite a while, but I was only representing 1 out of 10 constituents. What's wrong with that picture? Why is that acceptable in our community?
I don't know. And really, when you look at just the voter turnout itself, for example, when you look in 2017 in the race that elected Jennifer Ahern Koch and Hagen Brony, there was about a 23% turnout. But you got to realize each of those candidates didn't get 23% of the vote because there's split votes in there. And so what you end up having is commissioners that are elected by 13, maybe 14% of the electorate. When you flip that on its head, what you have is chief policymakers in this community that were not elected by over 85% of the electorate. And that isn't to say that they wouldn't have won if there's 100% turnout. But what we want to do is have the community have ownership of it. We want them to be bought into the policies that are coming through this community. And that starts with civic engagement, civic participation. And we know where it is, Suzanne. It is in the fall of even-numbered years.
Exactly. Partisanship. The Republican and Democratic parties, how are they, or are they going to get involved in this?
I haven't seen much involvement from either side of it. We've obviously been talking to them as stakeholders just to kind of get a pulse of it, and we've been talking to different representatives of it. We haven't seen it yet. With the election less than 2 months away, I don't necessarily know that we're going to see partisan involvement one way or another. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, to me, that there's a nonpartisan argument to be made that increased civic participation, increased voter turnout is good for everybody. It is not a partisan issue. I think our democracy suffers when 80% of the people that could vote don't vote. It doesn't matter why they're not voting, they are not participating, and we know where they do participate, and that's a nonpartisan thing. No one should be proud of the fact that we have 80% of the people who could vote not voting.
Right, and I know it is a core principle of the Democratic Party to maximize voter participation. And we vote on a lot of things that allude to that. So that's kind of interesting if that ever came up. Why are we not wanting complete voter turnout here? Why the pushback on that? Is this a control issue? When I was elected, there were very few people, they were very close-knit neighborhoods that I always called it the tyranny of the minority and the silent majority. The silent majority may be a factor in not everybody having the ability to vote.
Yeah, it's questionable at best, and I think it's always about a trade-off. No one will come out and say, hey, we don't want people to vote, or hey, a 20% voter participation is great, but they'll say that there are trade-offs that make that okay. And one of those trade-offs, they say, hey, when we host elections in the spring of odd-numbered years, there's not many things on the ballot, people could be more focused on it. And really, there's no data to suggest that people are any more intelligent voting on shorter ballots than they are on longer ballots. People vote for a litany of different reasons, and you don't take a test when you get to the ballot box to show what you do or do not know about a candidate and how you want to vote or how you don't want to vote. And it's interesting in the temperament we're here in the state of Florida, where you're going to see the restoration of felony voting rights coming before the electorate. Right. Why would we fight? Why would organizations fight so hard to restore voting rights to felons and then have them set up in a system like we have in the city of Sarasota where they're not going to vote anyway because the timing is bad? And so I think there's a larger conversation happening in the state of Florida and really around the state of the United States of America of how do we get people participating? How do we get people engaged? And so if we're going to do that, we need to be honest with ourselves and understand when we have archaic systems set up that are not encouraging voter participation and we know how we can do better, why would we not do it?
Exactly. So what would you say the long-term, if this passes, the long-term impact? How are we going to change here? This is a long time coming. Many people I've been working on this for many years, it seems, and had hoped to get a citizen or a commission-led initiative, and it never worked. It never worked. So we went out to do this, to decide the date and get the petitions. And we got many handily. What does that say?
I think when you speak to most people from an intuitive standpoint, you say, hey, we have an opportunity to save taxpayer dollars. By the way, it's $100,000 every election cycle to run these special elections. We can save money and we can triple voter turnout. When you present that on the surface, most intuitive individuals go, hey, that seems to make a lot of sense. And by the way, when you're talking to people in the city of Sarasota, when 80% of them are not participating in elections, and you're talking to them going, hey, I know you participate in the fall, would you like to move these other elections there? And most people get there pretty quickly. And so for me, the long-term vision of this is just a more engaged community. What we know is that people take ownership in places that they are involved. They buy into decisions that they make. It makes for a healthier community dialogue, and that's what we want to see here. I mean, any belief that the dais would change. I think the commissioners that are sitting on the dais today have every bit of a reasonable belief that they would sit on the dais regardless of when you hold the election. But if not, what you see is you have a legitimate purpose behind that when you have more people participating in the government. I mean, this is a key to it.
And that's it. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Earlier, we mentioned the landmark election lawsuit, James versus the city of Sarasota. That James was Ed James II, a pillar of this community and longtime leader and advocate for civil rights. His son, Ed James III, is a supporter of Change the Date. We recently talked to him about why. Hello, Ed. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great. I want to start the conversation about your family, the history, your iconic dad, Ed James, and all the influential history that your family has in this community fighting for civil rights and progressive ideals. Tell me a little bit about the background, and then we'll get into your support for Change the Date.
Well, I'm blessed to come from a long line of freedom fighters. I am a fourth generation Sarasotan, so my great-grandparents, Mary Emma and Jack Jones, settled here in Sarasota in the early 1920s. And my great-grandmother was a part of that group of activists that helped integrate our beaches here in Sarasota County. It's easy for us to go out today and go to the beaches and would say enjoy it, but we're dealing with a little bit of red tide here. But she had to really put her life and frankly her life and her body on the line so that we could all enjoy a sunset at Lido or Siesta Key. And she was one of many people. It wasn't just her, but when you go out to Lido Beach today, those folks who paid the price are memorialized there. So it truly means a lot to me. And my grandmother, Annie Mae McElroy, actually wrote the first seminal text about the history of black settlers here in Sarasota. It's called But Your World and My World. It was written in the late 1980s, and it's in the Sarasota County Public Library system. But more importantly, she was a part of the first graduating class of Booker High School in the late 1930s. So if you go out to Booker High today, you'll find that the Media Center is actually named after her. And she served as a teacher in Sarasota County Schools for 42 years. And my father, who I'm his namesake, and it's such a blessing to be that. He fought for civil rights, I think, ever since he came out of my grandmother's womb. One of the first things or most notable things that people know him for is integrating our library system. He was actually the first African American in Sarasota County to have a library card. And that's when he, as an 18-year-old, marched down to Ken Thompson's office. Ken Thompson, former city manager. If you go out to Longboat Key, you'll see his name. But he marched down to Ken Thompson's office and said, look, my parents are tax-paying citizens, my grandparents are tax-paying citizens. I attend a public university here in the state of Florida. At the time, he was home on break from FAMU. Why can't I check out a library book? And Ken Thompson said, well, you all have a library in Newtown, but at that time there was no real kind of brick and mortar library. There's just a place for you to come and pick up secondhand books. He challenged that system. And then fast forward a couple decades later, he and some other folks filed a lawsuit called James versus the City of Sarasota, which led to the single-member districts that we know of now in the City of Sarasota. There are 3 single-member districts on the Sarasota City Commission, and they filed that because they felt that it was in violation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
So where that set the tone for what is to come here. How does that reconcile with what's going on now with Change the Date, the referendum coming up, and how do you think that will affect persons of color, or your district,
Yeah.
or in general persons of color? You sat at the feet of your iconic father and the history of your relatives. How does that translate now into what you want to see for your district and for your entire community?
Well, I think the cornerstone of democracy is voter participation. And I think ultimately when I think about the fight that my grandparents and even my parents fought, it is incumbent upon us to do all that we can to expand that right to vote. And currently as it stands, the voter participation in the spring elections in the city are absolutely abysmal, particularly as it relates to people of color and young people. So I think giving people the opportunity to make that decision in the fall is something that, you know, ultimately is their right as citizens, right? You should have the right to determine what your democratic process looks like. If they decide that they don't want to change the date, then that's fine. But if they decide that they do, I think it will usher in more voter participation, and we'll see people who are elected to the city commission will truly be elected by a larger number of folks, and will actually be beholden to more individuals rather than the small number of individuals who put them there.
So what's the pushback? Have you heard pushback in the community in District 1 that maybe certain people that might have some effect on policy decisions, what their concerns are about this?
I've heard pushback, but it's been based in fear and not in fact. You know, ultimately, I think what speaks to the voters' desire to change the date is the fact that there were more people in District 1 to sign the petition to get it on the ballot than there were individuals who actually voted in the 2011 election for District 1. So you took it to the voters, they decided that that's what they wanted to see. Again, the cornerstone of democracy is voter participation, and this is a true representation of direct democracy.
Absolutely. Interestingly, the local Democratic Party has not, at this point yet, endorsed the referendum. So do you think that position is consistent with our progressive populist movement it's spreading across the country right now, especially as we come to the midterm elections? And it's getting traction. What do you think about that? Do you think does any of this fly in the face of this referendum?
Well,
or does it coincide with it?
Well, I certainly can't speak for the Democratic Party because I'm simply one man, one vote. What I can say is that it seems to be somewhat paradoxical that one would support felons' rights restoration and not support change the date, right? Because both of them are expanding the electorate.
Sure. And do you believe that voter turnout is a reasonable measure of public trust in this whole process? Because what we're talking about is voter turnout, and to that point of one of the core values of the Democratic Party, and I would hope other entities, to expand voter turnout to everybody,
Right. Well, I think one thing that we've been trying to counter is voter apathy. But I think 2018, if we look no further than just the primary, at least on the Democratic side, when we're talking about the gubernatorial election, we saw record numbers of people turning out. So I think that if we truly want to continue to see that wave continue into 2019 and beyond, we have to start embracing measures that will increase voter turnout.
Absolutely. It's interesting because it seems like you're at the helm here a lot. We started out with the history of your family and how you're poised now to move forward with this, and this is something you've been door to door with this effort, haven't you, with Change the Date?
Absolutely. Sweat equity. I always believe that if you believe in anything, you need to put boots to the ground. And so it's something that I feel very passionate about. It's something that I think is good for young people. I'm both a young person here in Sarasota, and I'm also a person of color, but beyond that, I'm somebody who just truly believes in democracy, which is why I decided to lace up my boots and really go door to door for this.
Well, we're having this, it's coming up, it's on the ballot, and I really appreciate your insight on this, and we look forward to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it, folks. This will be an historic election in many, many ways, nationally, statewide, and right here in Sarasota. So make sure you get out and vote. The election is Tuesday, November 6th. If you are not registered or not sure if you are registered, go to the Supervisor of Elections website, sarasotavotes.com, or you can call them at 941-861-8600. And of course, don't forget to see this show and any of our past shows on my website, SuzanneAtwell.org, or my Facebook and YouTube page. We appreciate your comments and hope you visit us. So that wraps it up for this show. Glad you joined us. Hope you learned something and found it interesting. Until next time, I'm Suzanne Atwell, and I'll see you around town.